The Nevada desert sun scorched the cracked asphalt outside Black Ridge Penitentiary, a sprawling fortress of weathered concrete and rusted steel that seemed to soak up the heat and hold it like a smoldering grudge. It was late morning, the kind of day where the air shimmered with a restless, almost palpable tension, and the distant hum of cicadas only deepened the oppressive silence within the prison's high walls. The heavy iron gates screeched open, admitting a battered yellow bus that coughed thick exhaust into the arid air. Inside, a dozen new inmates sat shackled, their faces etched with a mix of defiance, dread, and hollow resignation. Among them was Ethan Caldwell, seated near the back, his head slightly bowed, hazel eyes fixed on the scuffed, grime-streaked floor. Lean and unassuming, with short brown hair and a quiet demeanor, Ethan blended seamlessly into the orange jumpsuit, identical to those around him. To the guards barking orders as the bus lurched to a halt, he was just another number in the system, barely worth a glance. To the other inmates, he was invisible, a nobody in a place where being unnoticed could be as perilous as standing out. In Black Ridge, survival hinged on navigating an unspoken hierarchy, and Ethan, at first glance, seemed destined to be swallowed whole by its brutality. Intake was a chaotic ritual of shouted commands, clanging metal, and the sharp, chemical tang of industrial cleaner that clung to the air. Ethan moved through it with mechanical precision, answering questions in a low, steady voice, his hands calm as he was fingerprinted and photographed under the flickering fluorescent lights. The guards barely registered him, their attention drawn to the louder inmates, the ones who puffed out their chests, spat curses under their breath, or glared with open defiance. Ethan didn't draw eyes. He kept his shoulders relaxed, his gaze soft but sharp, absorbing every detail. The chipped gray paint peeling from the walls, the rhythmic thud of the guards' boots echoing in the corridor, the faint whiff of bleach masking a deeper, sour rot. By the time he was assigned to cell Block C, he'd already mapped the intake hall in his mind, the positions of the cameras, the locations of the exits, the guards who looked too weary to notice much. It wasn't about plotting escape or rebellion. It was just how Ethan's mind worked. Always observing, always calculating. A reflex honed over more than a decade of training he hadn't shared with a soul. Cell Block C was a concrete labyrinth, a warren of narrow corridors and barred cells that housed some of Black Ridge's most volatile men. The air was thick with the sounds of slamming doors, low murmurs, and the occasional shout that ricocheted off the walls like a warning shot. Ethan stepped into the block, carrying his standard-issue bedding, a thin mattress that sagged in the middle, a scratchy blanket that smelled of mildew, and a pillow that felt more like a sack of sand. His footsteps were light but deliberate, his eyes scanning without lingering too long on any one face. The other inmates sized him up as he passed, their gazes quick and dismissive. Too small to be a threat. Too quiet to be worth their time. A few smirked, their eyes glinting with the predatory instinct that thrived in Black Ridge, already marking him as prey in a place where weakness was a death sentence. Ethan felt their stares but didn't react. He'd been in unforgiving places before, not prisons, but environments just as brutal, where survival demanded a careful balance of strength and restraint, and he knew the first rule was to keep your cards hidden. So he kept his head down, found his cell a cramped 8x10 box with a rusted sink and a bunk bolted to the wall, and set about arranging his things with the same calm focus he'd shown all day. That's when he first heard the name Victor Kane, or Iron, as the inmates called him. It came in hushed tones, passed between men in the mess hall as Ethan lined up for his first meal, a tray of grayish mashed potatoes, overcooked green beans, and a slice of bread that felt like cardboard in his hands. "Iron's got his eye on the new fish," one inmate muttered, nodding toward Ethan as he balanced his tray. "Won't be long before he's fetching Iron's laundry or scrubbing his cell." Another gave a low, nervous chuckle, and Ethan caught the glance they shared, part pity, part relief that it wasn't them in the crosshairs. He didn't ask questions, didn't look up. He just took his tray and found a seat at the edge of a table, alone, where he could watch the room without drawing attention. The mess hall was a pressure cooker, a sea of orange jumpsuits and tense postures, where every glance carried weight and every word could spark a brawl. Ethan ate slowly, his movements deliberate, his eyes scanning the crowd without lingering too long on any one face, taking in the subtle currents of power and fear that flowed through the room. Victor Kane was impossible to miss. He stood at the center of the mess hall like a mountain. 6'6", and built like a freight train. His shaved head gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. His arms were thick with muscle, scarred from fights he'd never lost, and his presence alone seemed to bend the air around him, drawing every eye in the room. He moved through the mess hall with a predator's swagger, his crew trailing behind 3 men, each hardened by years inside, their loyalty to Victor written in their smirks and the way they scanned the room for trouble. Victor didn't need to raise his voice to command attention. His shadow was enough. When his eyes landed on Ethan, it was like a spotlight cutting through fog. Ethan felt it, a prickle at the back of his neck, but he didn't flinch. He kept eating, his fork moving steadily, his face blank. Victor's lips curled into a grin, the kind that promised trouble, and he leaned over to one of his crew, muttering something that made them laugh, a low, guttural sound that carried across the room. Ethan didn't hear the words, but he didn't need to. He'd seen men like Victor before, bullies who fed on fear, who thrived on breaking others to prop themselves up, their power built on the wreckage of those they crushed. The first test came that afternoon in the yard, a dusty stretch of asphalt hemmed in by chain-link fences, topped with coils of razor wire that glinted in the merciless Sunday. The heat was suffocating, baking the ground until it radiated warmth, and the inmates scattered across the yard in clusters, lifting weights, playing cards, or pacing to burn off the restless energy that festered inside. Ethan found a spot near the bleachers, sitting alone, his back against the warm metal, watching the yard like a chessboard. He noted everything. The way one group steered clear of another, the way the guards lingered near the gate but ignored the far corner where deals were made in whispers, the way certain inmates moved with purpose while others shrank into themselves. He was still mapping the dynamics when Victor's shadow fell over him. "New guy," Victor said, his voice low and rough, like gravel underfoot. Ethan looked up, his expression neutral, and nodded once. Victor's grin widened, predatory. "You got a name, or you just gonna sit there looking like a lost puppy?" "Ethan," he said simply, his voice steady but soft, barely carrying over the yard's ambient noise of shouts and clanging weights. Victor's crew snickered, and one of them, a wiry guy with a scar slicing across his cheek, mimicked Ethan's tone, drawing a laugh from the others. Victor crouched down, leveling his gaze with Ethan's, his eyes probing for a crack, a flinch, anything he could exploit. "Ethan, huh? You don't look like you belong here. Too soft. Bet you cry yourself to sleep tonight, don't you?" The words were a jab, meant to provoke, but Ethan just held his gaze, unblinking, his face a mask of calm. After a long, tense moment, Victor stood, chuckling. "We'll see how long that lasts," he said, and walked away, his crew trailing like hyenas circling a kill. Ethan watched them go, his hands resting loosely on his knees, his breathing even. He knew this was just the opening move in a game he hadn't chosen to play. That night, in the dim light of his cell, Ethan lay on his bunk, staring at the cracked ceiling where shadows danced from the flickering hallway lights. The sounds of Blackridge surrounded him: coughs, snores, the occasional shout from a cell down the block, the distant clang of a guard's keys. He wasn't thinking about Victor or the yard. He was thinking about Chicago, about the small, dimly lit gym where he'd spent over a decade training in Krav Maga, a discipline that wasn't just about fighting, but about surviving. His instructor, a grizzled ex-soldier named Lev, had drilled it into him. The strongest fighter is the one who doesn't need to fight. Control your mind, and your body will follow. Those words had guided Ethan through countless sparring matches, through bruises and broken bones, through moments when he could have lashed out but chose restraint instead. Now, in Blackridge, they were a lifeline, a reminder to stay focused, to wait for the right moment, to keep his true strength hidden until it was needed. The next morning, Ethan met Jamie, a scrawny kid barely out of his teens, with nervous eyes and a habit of biting his nails until they bled. Jamie was assigned to the same work detail as Ethan cleaning the mess hall after breakfast, and he stuck close, like a stray sensing safety. They worked side by side, scrubbing tables with worn rags, the air heavy with the smell of grease and disinfectant. "You gotta watch out for iron," Jamie whispered, his voice low to avoid the guard's ears. "He picks one guy every few months, makes an example out of him, Keeps everyone else in line. Last guy. They sent him to the infirmary for a month, jaw wired shut. Ethan nodded, his cloth moving in steady circles across the tabletop, leaving faint streaks in the grime. Why you so calm about it? Jamie asked, his brow furrowing, his voice tinged with a mix of fear and curiosity. You seen him. He's a monster. Ethan paused, just for a second, and gave Jamie a small, reassuring smile. Monsters only win if you let 'em, he said softly, his words carrying a quiet conviction that made Jamie pause. Then Ethan went back to scrubbing, his movements unhurried, as if the weight of Victor's threat didn't touch him. The harassment escalated over the next few days, subtle at first but growing bolder with each passing hour. Victor's crew accidentally bumped Ethan in the hallway, their shoulders slamming into his with enough force to bruise. His tray was knocked from his hands in the mess hall, the food splattering across the floor to a chorus of mocking laughter. Once, his blanket was doused with water, leaving his bunk damp and cold, the mildew smell now joined by the faint stink of malice. Through it all, Ethan stayed silent, his face unreadable, his movements precise. He didn't flinch, didn't snap back, didn't give them the reaction they craved. To the other inmates, it made him look weaker, a pushover who wouldn't fight back, a man who'd bend until he broke. To Victor, it was a challenge, a puzzle he was determined to crack. This guy's got no spine, Victor said loudly one day, tossing Ethan's book, a worn copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, into a puddle in the yard. The other inmates laughed, their jeers echoing across the asphalt. But Jamie, standing nearby, saw something they didn't. The way Ethan's hands tightened briefly before relaxing. The way his eyes flicked to Victor's stance, measuring, calculating, like a predator sizing up its prey. The breaking point came a week after Ethan's arrival, in the mess hall during lunch. The room was packed, the air thick with the smell of overcooked vegetables, sweat, and the ever-present undercurrent of tension. Ethan sat alone, his tray in front of him, a meager portion of watery soup and a stale roll. Victor strode over, his crew in tow, their footsteps heavy with purpose. Without a word, Victor grabbed Ethan's tray and upended it, sending soup and plastic clattering to the floor in a wet, messy heap. The room went quiet, every eye on them, waiting for the show that always followed when iron picked his target. Victor leaned in close, his voice a low growl that carried a promise of pain. Pick it up, new guy, he said, his grin sharp as a blade, or I'll make you lick it clean. Ethan looked at the mess, then at Victor, his eyes steady, unyielding, a faint flicker of something unreadable passing through them. For a moment, the room held its breath, the silence so thick it seemed to hum. Then Ethan knelt, picked up the tray, and stood, his movements slow and deliberate, his posture straight, but not defiant. He didn't say a word, didn't meet Victor's gaze again, just walked to the trash bin and dumped the tray with a soft clatter. The laughter that followed was deafening, a wave of jeers and taunts that echoed off the concrete walls. Victor stood triumphant, his arms crossed, his crew slapping his back like he'd won a war. But Jamie, watching from a nearby table, saw something else. As Ethan walked away, his steps were too smooth, too controlled, like a man who knew exactly what he was doing. His hands didn't shake, his shoulders didn't slump. There was no defeat in his posture, only patience, a quiet strength that Jamie couldn't quite name but felt in his bones. His heart raced, not with fear but with a strange certainty that something was coming, something that would turn Blackridge upside down. Ethan wasn't just enduring, he was waiting, and when the time came, Jamie knew, Victor wouldn't see it coming. The other inmates might have laughed, but Jamie saw the truth. Ethan was no prey. He was something else entirely, and Blackridge was about to find out what. The days following the mess hall incident settled into a tense, uneasy rhythm at Blackridge Penitentiary, where the desert heat seeped through the concrete walls, making the air feel thick and restless. Ethan Caldwell moved through the prison like a shadow, his presence barely a ripple in the chaotic tide of cell block C. To the other inmates, his silence after Victor Iron Cane's public humiliation marked him as broken, a man who'd crumbled under the weight of Blackridge's brutal hierarchy. Their laughter followed him, sharp jeers in the hallways, mocking whispers in the yard, The nickname, Mule, spat like an insult, but Ethan kept his head down, his hazel eyes calm and unreadable, his steps measured and deliberate. To the untrained eye, he was a man defeated, shrinking into himself to avoid further punishment. But to those who looked closer, like Jamie, the scrawny kid who'd latched onto him during work detail, there was something else in Ethan's silence. Not weakness, but a deliberate stillness, like a predator waiting for the precise moment to strike. Victor Kane, the undisputed king of Cell Block C, saw only a target ripe for breaking. The mess hall stunt had cemented his dominance. But it wasn't enough. Men like Victor didn't thrive on single victories. They needed to grind their opponents into dust, to ensure no one dared challenge their rule. Ethan's lack of reaction, his refusal to beg, fight, or even flinch, gnawed at Victor like an itch he couldn't scratch. It was unnatural, infuriating, a puzzle that demanded solving. So Victor escalated, his crew trailing him like loyal shadows, eager to carry out his orders. In the days that followed, the harassment grew sharper, more deliberate. Designed to provoke, Ethan's bunk was trashed during morning count. His thin mattress flipped, his few possessions a worn copy of Meditations, a toothbrush, a carefully folded letter from someone long gone scattered across the cell's cold floor. In the communal showers, someone accidentally elbowed him, the blow landing hard enough to leave a bruise blooming across his ribs, a dull ache that lingered through the day. Once, during yard time, Victor's crew cornered him near the chain-link fence, tossing his shoes into the dust and daring him to pick them up while they loomed over him, smirking. Each time, Ethan responded with the same maddening calm, retrieving his things without a word, his movements precise, his face an unreadable mask. The inmates laughed louder, their taunts echoing off the concrete, but Victor's grin grew tighter, his dark eyes narrowing with each non-reaction, sensing a challenge he couldn't yet name. Jamie, scrubbing tables beside Ethan during their work detail, couldn't wrap his head around it. The mess hall was quiet that morning, the air heavy with the smell of grease and disinfectant, and Jamie's voice was a nervous whisper as he leaned closer. "Why don't you do something, man?" he said, his bitten nails tapping against the tabletop. "They're gonna keep coming at you till you break. You gotta push back. Show 'em you're not scared." Ethan's cloth moved in steady circles, wiping away sticky remnants of breakfast, his eyes fixed on the task. "Pushing back's what they want," he said softly, his voice low enough that only Jamie could hear over the distant clatter of trays. "Give 'em a reaction, and they own you. You let them set the rules." Jamie frowned, his brow furrowing, his thin frame tense with frustration. "So what? You just let 'em walk all over you? That's no way to survive here, Ethan." Ethan paused, just for a moment, and looked at Jamie, his gaze steady but not unkind, a faint warmth in his eyes. "Surviving's not about winning every fight, it's about picking the one that matters. You wait for the right moment, and you make it count." Jamie stared at him, caught between admiration and confusion, the words sinking in like a lifeline. He didn't fully understand, but something in Ethan's calm conviction made him believe there was a plan, even if he couldn't see it. At night, when the cell block quieted to a low hum of snores, coughs, and distant shouts, Ethan lay on his bunk, staring at the cracked ceiling where shadows flickered from the hallway's dim lights. The sounds of Blackridge surrounded him, the creak of a bunk, the rustle of a guard's keys, the low murmur of a conversation in a nearby cell. But his mind was elsewhere, back in a small, dimly lit gym in Chicago, where he'd spent over a decade training in Krav Maga. The memories were sharp. The creak of the wooden floor under his feet, the sting of sweat in his eyes, the gruff voice of his instructor, Lev, barking corrections as he adjusted Ethan's stance. "It's not about strength," Lev had said, his weathered hands steadying Ethan's shoulders. "It's about precision, timing, control. You fight when you have to, not when you want to. A real fighter knows the difference." Ethan had been 16 when he started, a skinny kid with a chip on his shoulder, bouncing between foster homes, looking for a way to channel the anger that simmered inside him. Krav Maga gave him more than self-defense. It gave him discipline, a way to tame the chaos of his past. He'd learned to read opponents, to anticipate their moves, to end fights before they began. Over the years, he'd honed his body and mind into a weapon, not for show but for survival. A tool he kept hidden until it was needed. Now, in Blackridge, those lessons were his shield, keeping him grounded as Victor's campaign of torment intensified. The harassment took a darker turn one evening in the laundry room, a humid, windowless space where the air was thick with the smell of detergent, damp cloth, and something faintly metallic. Ethan was folding sheets during his assigned shift, his hands moving with the same precision he applied to everything. When Victor's crew appeared, their silhouettes filling the doorway like a storm cloud, the other inmates on duty scattered, heads down, knowing better than to get caught in the crossfire. Victor leaned against a washing machine, his massive frame dwarfing the room, his grin sharp and cold. "You're real good at folding, mule," he said, his voice dripping with mockery, the nickname cutting through the air like a blade. "Bet you'd be even better locked in here all night. Give you time to think about your place." Before Ethan could respond, the crew moved, swift and coordinated, shoving him into a storage closet barely big enough to turn around in. The door slammed shut, the lock clicking with a finality that echoed in the cramped space. Their laughter rang out, muffled through the metal walls, as they walked away, leaving Ethan in darkness. The air was stifling, heavy with the smell of bleach and mildew, the walls close enough to brush his shoulders. But Ethan didn't panic. He didn't bang on the door or shout for help. Instead, he sat cross-legged on the cold floor, closed his eyes, and breathed deeply, his mind slipping into the calm focus Lev had taught him. He counted his breaths, visualized his next moves, and waited. Hours later, when a guard finally unlocked the door, muttering about "damn pranks," Ethan emerged without a word, his face as composed as ever, ignoring the smirks of Victor's crew lingering nearby. The closet incident only fueled Victor's obsession. Ethan's silence wasn't just defiance. It was a direct challenge to his authority. A crack in the armor of fear he'd built around cell block C. The other inmates began to notice, their whispers shifting from mockery to curiosity. "Guy's got nerves of steel," one muttered during yard time, watching Ethan sit alone by the bleachers, his posture relaxed but alert. "Or he's just crazy," another replied. But there was a hint of doubt in his voice, a question mark where certainty used to be. Jamie, meanwhile, grew bolder in Ethan's presence, his nervous energy easing as they worked together. One afternoon, as they swept the mess hall, Jamie hesitated before speaking, his voice barely above a whisper. "I got jumped my first week here," he admitted, his eyes fixed on the broom in his hands. "Didn't know how to fight back. Still don't. They took my shoes, my food, everything. I just froze." Ethan glanced at him, his expression softening, a rare glimpse of warmth breaking through his usual reserve. "Stand tall. Keep your eyes up. Don't let 'em see you're scared." "Sometimes that's enough to make 'em think twice." Jamie nodded, trying to mimic Ethan's posture, his shoulders straightening for the first time in weeks. It wasn't much, but it felt like a start, a spark of confidence in a place designed to snuff it out. Ethan's influence on Jamie didn't go unnoticed. During yard time the next day, in a quiet corner away from the main clusters of inmates, Ethan showed him a simple stance, feet apart, knees slightly bent, hands loose but ready. "It's not about fighting," Ethan said, keeping his voice low as Jamie mirrored his movements. "It's about being ready. You show you're not afraid, and half the battle's won." Jamie practiced, his movements clumsy but earnest, his skinny frame wobbling as he tried to balance. Ethan corrected him gently, his patience a stark contrast to the yard's usual chaos of shouts, clanging weights, and the occasional scuffle. A few inmates watched from a distance, their expressions unreadable, but Victor's crew took note, their smirks fading into something harder, more wary. Ethan was crossing a line. Not by fighting but by building something. A connection. A spark of defiance in someone as vulnerable as Jamie. It was a threat Victor couldn't ignore, a challenge to the fear-based order he'd enforced for years. The breaking point came in the prison workshop, a cavernous room filled with the clatter of tools, the whine of saws, and the sharp smell of sawdust and oil. It was one of the few places in Blackridge without cameras, a blind spot where disputes were settled, and scores evened out away from the guard's eyes. Ethan was sanding a wooden chair, his hands moving with the same precision he applied to everything. The rhythm of his work, almost meditative. The other inmates in the workshop were busy with their tasks, cutting wood, assembling frames, the usual hum of activity when Victor and his crew appeared, their heavy footsteps cutting through the noise. The room went quiet, the other inmates clearing out without a word, sensing trouble like animals before a storm. Victor tossed a dirty rag at Ethan's feet, his grin cold and predatory. "Polish my boots, mule," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a command, the air around him crackling with menace. Ethan didn't move, his sandpaper pausing mid-stroke, his eyes lifting slowly to meet Victor's for the first time. There was no fear in his gaze, only a quiet intensity that made the air feel heavier, charged with something unspoken. Victor's grin faltered, just for a second, before he stepped closer, his massive frame looming. "You deaf?" he growled, shoving Ethan back against a workbench, the tools rattling loudly. "I said polish my boots." The workshop was silent now, the distant hum of machinery fading into the background, the air thick with anticipation. Ethan stood his ground, the rag still at his feet, his body relaxed but alert, every muscle poised. Victor's fist shot out, a heavy right hook aimed at Ethan's jaw, meant to crush his defiance in one blow. But Ethan moved fast, fluid, almost imperceptible. He sidestepped, his body angling just enough to let the punch sail past, then countered with a sharp, controlled elbow to Victor's ribs. The crack was audible, a sickening sound that made Victor's crew freeze in their tracks. Victor gasped, stumbling back, his eyes wide with shock and pain. Before he could recover, Ethan struck again, a knee to the thigh, a palm to the shoulder, each move precise, surgical, designed to disable without destroying. Victor hit the ground hard, his bulk shaking the concrete floor, his breaths coming in ragged heaves. The crew hesitated, their confidence shattered, their eyes darting between their fallen leader and the man they'd underestimated. Ethan didn't advance. He stepped back, his hands loose at his sides, his breathing steady, as if he hadn't just dismantled the king of Cell Block C. The silence that followed was deafening, a stunned hush that seemed to hold the workshop in a vice. Victor's crew stood frozen, their bravado gone, their eyes wide with disbelief. Ethan's voice, when he spoke, was calm but firm, cutting through the tension like a blade. "I don't want trouble," he said, his gaze sweeping the room, steady and unflinching. "But I'm not your mule." He turned and walked away, his steps unhurried, leaving Victor groaning on the floor, clutching his ribs. The workshop's air buzzed with shock, the few remaining inmates staring as Ethan disappeared through the door. Word of the fight spread like wildfire, whispered in cells, muttered in the yard, passed from one inmate to another like a forbidden secret. By lights out, Ethan was no longer invisible. Inmates glanced at him with a mix of awe, fear, and curiosity, their laughter replaced by questions. Who was this guy? How had he taken down iron so easily, with such precision? Even the guards, usually indifferent, began to watch him more closely, their hands lingering near their batons, their eyes narrowing with suspicion. But Ethan didn't revel in the victory. He returned to his routine cleaning tables, eating his meals, sitting quietly in the yard, his demeanor unchanged, his face as unreadable as ever. Jamie, however, couldn't hide his excitement, his nervous energy replaced by a boyish grin. "You destroyed him," he whispered the next morning, his eyes wide as they scrubbed tables side by side. "Nobody's ever done that to iron, Ethan. Nobody." Ethan shook his head, his expression serious, his voice low. "It's not about destroying anyone," he said. "It's about showing them they don't own you. You stand your ground, but you don't lose yourself doing it." Jamie nodded, his admiration growing. But Ethan's words carried a weight that lingered, a reminder that the fight wasn't the end, it was a spark, a shift in the delicate balance of Blackridge. Victor would recover, and when he did, he'd come for Ethan harder than before, his pride wounded, his authority shaken. But Ethan wasn't thinking about Victor. He was thinking about Jamie, about the other inmates who lived in fear, about the possibility of something better in a place built on despair. And as the whispers spread through the cell block, so did a quiet hope, a flicker of change that would soon test the very foundations of Blackridge Penitentiary. The air in Blackridge Penitentiary felt different after the workshop incident, as if the concrete walls themselves held their breath, waiting for what would come next. Ethan Caldwell, once invisible, was now a name whispered with a mix of awe and unease. The story of how he'd dropped Victor Iron Kane, the untouchable king of cell block C, spread like a spark in dry grass, igniting conversations in the yard, the mess hall, and the dim corners of cells after lights out. Inmates who'd once mocked him as mule now glanced his way with cautious respect, their eyes lingering not out of scorn, but curiosity. The guards, too, watched him differently, their hands resting closer to their batons, their gazes sharper, as if sensing a shift in the prison's fragile balance. But Ethan didn't bask in the attention. He moved through his days with the same quiet focus, cleaning tables, eating his meals, sitting alone by the bleachers, his hazel eyes calm, his posture relaxed but alert. To him, the fight wasn't a victory to celebrate. It was a necessity, a line drawn to protect his dignity, not to claim power. Victor, meanwhile, was a shadow of his former self. The man who'd once strode through Blackridge like a colossus now limped through the yard, his ribs taped, his face bruised, his eyes avoiding Ethan's. His crew still followed, but their swagger was muted, their loyalty tinged with uncertainty. The other inmates noticed, their whispers turning from Ethan's feet to Victor's fall. "Iron's done," one muttered during yard time, tossing a glance at Victor sitting alone on a bench. "Guy's lost his edge." But Ethan knew better. Men like Victor didn't stay down forever. A wounded predator was still a predator, and Victor's silence was not surrender. It was a gathering storm. Ethan felt it in the way Victor's crew glared at him, their eyes promising retribution, and in the way the air in cell block C grew heavier, charged with the anticipation of a reckoning. Jamie, the scrawny kid who'd become Ethan's shadow, was the only one who saw the fight as something more than a spectacle. To him, Ethan was a lifeline, a proof that Blackridge's brutality didn't have to define you. During their work detail, as they swept the mess hall's concrete floor, Jamie's nervous energy had given way to a quiet determination. "You changed everything," he said one morning, his voice low but fervent, his broom moving in uneven strokes. "Nobody's laughing at you now. They're scared of you." Ethan shook his head, his cloth wiping down a table with steady precision. "It's not about making them scared," he said softly. "It's about showing them there's another way. You don't have to be a victim or a bully. There's a middle ground." Jamie frowned, processing the words, his bitten nails tapping against the broom handle. "But you fought him," he said. "You had to." Ethan nodded, his eyes meeting Jamie's. "I fought because I had to, not because I wanted to. There's a difference. You'll see it when it's your turn to choose." Ethan's influence on Jamie deepened in the weeks that followed. During yard time, in the same quiet corner where they'd practiced stances, Ethan began teaching him more, not just how to stand or move, but how to think. "It's about control," Ethan said one afternoon, adjusting Jamie's posture as he practiced a defensive block. "You control your fear, your anger, your choices. That's what makes you strong, not how hard you hit." Jamie listened, his movements less clumsy now, his skinny frame carrying a new confidence. Other inmates started to notice, drawn by the quiet lessons unfolding in the yard's shadow. A wiry man named Carlos, who'd spent his first month in Blackridge hiding from fights, joined them one day, hesitant but curious. Then came Malik, a lanky teenager with a quick laugh but a history of being targeted. Ethan didn't turn them away. He taught them simple techniques: how to shift their weight, how to read an opponent's intent, how to stay calm under pressure. "It's not about fighting," he told them, his voice steady. "It's about protecting yourself without losing who you are." The group was small, no more than 4 or 5, but it was enough to send ripples through the yard, a quiet rebellion against the prison's culture of fear. Victor's crew watched from a distance, their glares hardening with each passing day. Ethan's lessons weren't just a challenge to their boss's authority. They were a threat to the entire power structure of cell block C. The yard, once a battleground of fists and threats, grew quieter, the usual scuffles less frequent. Inmates who'd lived in constant fear began to stand a little taller, their eyes meeting those of their tormentors instead of dropping to the ground. Even the guards noticed, their reports noting a drop in incident logs, though they didn't understand why. Ethan's influence was subtle but undeniable, a shift that felt fragile, like a truce that could shatter at any moment. And Victor, nursing his wounds and his pride, was the spark waiting to ignite it. The tension broke one blistering afternoon in the yard, where the sun baked the asphalt until it shimmered like a mirage. A dispute had been brewing for days between two rival groups, one loyal to Victor's crew, the other a loose coalition of inmates, tired of his reign. It started with words, shouted insults escalating into shoves near the weight racks. Knives, crude but deadly, flashed in the sunlight, fashioned from sharpened plastic and smuggled metal. The guards were slow to react, their attention split, and the yard teetered on the edge of a full-scale brawl. Ethan, sitting by the bleachers with Jamie, Carlos and Malik, felt the shift before he saw it, the way the air tightened, the way voices grew sharper. He stood, his movements calm but deliberate, and walked toward the growing crowd, his small group trailing hesitantly behind. Victor was there, his injuries not fully healed but his presence still commanding, his crew rallying around him. He stood between the two groups, his voice loud, egging them on, sensing a chance to reclaim his dominance. "Let's settle this," he roared, his scarred arms spread wide, a knife glinting in one hand. The other inmates shouted, their anger boiling over, ready to erupt. Ethan stepped into the circle, his hands empty, his posture relaxed but unyielding. The yard went quiet, all eyes on him, the man who'd humbled iron. Victor's grin was cold, his eyes locking onto Ethan's. "You want another round, mule?" he sneered, twirling the knife. Ethan didn't flinch. "Put it down," he said, his voice calm but firm, carrying across the yard. "This doesn't have to end in blood," the crowd murmured, some scoffing, others uncertain. Victor laughed. But it was forced, his confidence shaken by the memory of the workshop. "You think you run this place now?" he spat, stepping closer, the knife gleaming. Ethan held his ground, his eyes steady, reading Victor's stance, his grip, his intent. "Nobody runs this place," Ethan said. "Not you, not me. But we can all walk away from this, or we can let it tear us apart." His words hung in the air, simple but heavy, cutting through the noise. Jamie, standing behind him, stepped forward, his skinny frame trembling but his voice clear. "He's right," he said, surprising even himself. "We don't need this." Carlos and Malik nodded, their presence adding weight to Ethan's words. The crowd hesitated, the knives lowering slightly, the tension wavering. Victor's eyes darted between Ethan and the crowd, his pride warring with the reality of his weakened position. For a moment, it seemed he'd lunge, but Ethan's gaze held him, unflinching, a silent reminder of what had happened in the workshop. Slowly, Victor lowered the knife, his jaw tight, his crew following his lead. The other group backed off, their own weapons disappearing into pockets. The guards, finally arriving, shouted orders, breaking up the crowd. But the fight never came. The yard dispersed, the air still charged but no longer explosive. Ethan walked away, his group following, their steps steady, their heads high. In the weeks that followed, Blackridge changed. The violence didn't vanish, but it slowed, like a storm that had lost its fury. Inmates who'd once ruled through fear kept to themselves, their power diluted by the quiet strength Ethan had shown. Victor, humbled, retreated to the edges of the yard, his crew smaller, his influence waning. Ethan's group grew, not into a gang but a community, a handful of men learning to stand up without tearing others down. They met in the yard, in the library, sharing what Ethan taught: control, restraint, the power of choice. Even some guards began to nod in acknowledgement, their reports noting fewer fights, a calmer block. Ethan didn't seek leadership, but it found him. Not through force but through example. One evening, as Ethan sat in his cell, Jamie slipped in, his eyes bright with a confidence that hadn't been there before. "You changed this place," he said, leaning against the wall. "Not just for me, for everyone." Ethan closed his book, a faint smile on his lips. "I didn't change anything," he said. "I just showed what's possible. Strength isn't about fists or fear, Jamie. It's about knowing who you are and holding on to it. no matter what they throw at you. You choose your battles, not to win, but to stay true. Jamie nodded, the lesson sinking in, a truth he'd carry beyond Blackridge. The lesson wasn't just for Jamie. It spread through the prison. A quiet revolution, born not of violence but of discipline and empathy. Ethan's actions taught Blackridge that true strength lies in restraint, in standing up without losing yourself, in lifting others instead of crushing them. In a place built on despair, he'd planted a seed of hope, proving that even in the darkest corners, one person's choices could light a path for others. And as the inmates began to see themselves not as predators or prey, but as men with choices, Blackridge became less a prison of walls and more a place where change, however small, was possible.